More civilians are killed in war today than soldiers. Very significant change. More aid workers being killed. The guardrails are no longer there. And that really got me thinking about this bigger trend of impunity, not just in war zones, but more widely. Recession in democratic rights, recession in human rights, ends up as recession in property rights. And it's really important because the rules-based order applies internally and externally. The international order was designed to buttress the democratic order at home. And I think that's what's under enormous strain. I think that what's at stake, therefore, is the ability of people to make their own choices. Because in the end, the definition of impunity is that someone else makes the choice for you.
Welcome to Meet the Leader. I'm Linda Lucina, and I am very excited to welcome you into our New York studios at the World Economic Forum for a very special conversation on leadership, this one on accountability. Meet the Leader turns 5 years old this year, and as we have dug into tactics and practical strategies for change, all of that has underpinned a bigger goal: to help leaders and teams tackle the biggest challenges of the day and help changemakers really meet the moment that they're in. These past 5 years have not been easy ones for leaders. They've seen the pandemic, widening economic gaps, climate chaos, and increasing geopolitical instability. David Miliband has thought a lot about these shifts and how they impact people on the ground. He is president and chief executive officer of the International Rescue Committee. That is a global humanitarian organization, one whose founding was inspired by Albert Einstein in the 1930s. And this organization helps give aid and relocation assistance to refugees and people whose lives have been turned inside out by war, conflict, and disaster. He'll talk to us about a trend he's tracked for years, the age of impunity, one where leaders seem less accountable to the power that they yield. He'll talk about that, how it's impacting humanitarian work, and the challenges ahead for leaders of any stripe. Welcome, David. How are you?
Linda, thank you very much for having me. You're so right. It's the moment. Meeting the moment is exactly it's actually the theme of our gala dinner this year.
That's amazing. Well, I love to be on trend.
You're definitely with the moment.
Let's talk a little bit about this for people who aren't familiar. What is the age of impunity, and why is it so important to understand?
Well, I came to this view, this understanding, not through theory, but through practice. Two of our humanitarian aid workers were driving an ambulance across western Syria, and they were hit by a missile sent by the Russian Air Force that was working on the side of President Assad during the Syrian civil war. And obviously the immediate trauma faces the organization. We've lost 2 staff members. But there's something I learned in politics, which was my previous career. In government, the great advantage is you see the big picture. The danger is you lose sight of the people. When you're running an NGO, as I do today, you're confronted by the people every day. The danger is you lose sight of the big picture. And encapsulated in that, it wasn't a tragedy, it was a crime that afflicted my 2 colleagues, was a bigger picture, which is that in war zones around the world, impunity was the order of the day. Whatever the rules said, whatever the laws of war said, impunity, which is the exercise of power without accountability. Baldwin, former British Prime Minister, said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What we saw in that war zone is what we're seeing elsewhere, which is that the guardrails are no longer there. And that really got me thinking about this bigger trend of impunity, not just in war zones, but more widely. And I suppose that's how I came to christen the idea of an age of impunity.
You work with the Eurasia Group on a special report that tracks all this. Can you talk a little bit about the Atlas of Impunity?
Yes, I'm grateful to the Eurasia Group, but also to the funders. I chair the advisory board. So it's an independent report that's done every year. That's the Atlas of Impunity. It measures impunity in every country in the world, more or less, across 5 different dimensions, not just conflict, although that's important, governance, human rights, and then 2 that are maybe give this added originality to this atlas. One is about economic impunity, which is about one thing that's obvious, which I suppose is the exploitation of employees, modern slavery being the worst example of that, but also when states encroach on property rights. That's impunity too. So there's an economic dimension. And the 5th dimension is environment. climate change. We see the abuse of the planet as an example of impunity from one generation to the next, and also from humans to the planet. So we have this scorecard, if you like, that measures impunity. Some things are obvious. You'd expect Afghanistan has very high impunity, Finland has very low impunity. But within that, you have some very interesting trends, and the purpose of the Atlas is to sponsor discussion, debate about this global issue that we perceive.
Tell us a little bit about how long the Atlas has been tracked for and what's gotten better and worse.
Well, next year will be the 4th edition of the Atlas of Impunity. It's quite hard to get the data sets that go far enough back. We have some data that goes back 5 years, 10 years. But with a lot of the data, we use dozens and dozens of different data sets. So it's done in a statistically appropriate way, the 5 measurements or the 5 indices. Here are some things that come out. One is that conflict is actually one of the biggest changes in the last 5 years. So there are 60 conflicts going on in the world today. 5 years ago, there were 39 conflicts. So you've got greater conflict, more and more people displaced by conflict. 5 years ago, about 75 million people, either as refugees or internally displaced. Today, 125 million people. So you've got some change there. You've also seen, I think, some very interesting moves in the middle of the Atlas. Saudi Arabia has more accountability than it did 5 years ago. You've seen countries, maybe some surprises. Not every democratic country is at the top of the Atlas. Singapore scores above some other countries that could claim to be more democratic. So this is an atlas that gives a different way of thinking about different trends in the world. Some things are common with very serious work like the Varieties of Democracy project at the University of Gothenburg. Freedom House, the United States charity, does very important work about the health of democracy, but that's a subset of this wider set of trends.
And you mentioned that, hey, maybe it's surprising that there are democratic countries there and which ones are maybe higher on the list than others. But what has personally surprised you about maybe some of the changes in the index?
I think that when you factor in environmental impunity, you scramble the scorecard a bit. So a country like Canada suddenly doesn't score as well as you might expect. I think that there are countries in Africa that are high scorers and that are low scorers. It's probably the continent with the biggest spread of the biggest spectrum of performance, if you like, against these indices. I'm also struck that countries can move a long way quite fast. And that's also, I think, striking. We don't know what's going to be in next year's Atlas, which will be published slightly later. We want to get more up-to-date data, so we'll publish in July next year for the 2026. My goodness, time flies, the 2026 index.
You have talked a little bit about how the age of impunity has started to evolve into another sort of more difficult age. Can you talk a little bit about that, the age of cruelty?
Well, I certainly think that the two are associated with each other. One of the things that, since I'm running a humanitarian organization, I'm faced every day with the question, well, there are 300 million people in humanitarian need. That means they depend on non-governmental organizations to survive effectively. The World Bank has recently revised up its estimate of the number of people living on less than $3 a day. So the amount of, it's a pretty stark measure of extreme poverty. That's their measure of extreme poverty. 800 million people, 810 million living in extreme poverty. And I think that what we're seeing is that certainly in the world's conflict zones, we're seeing two things that are very, very striking. One is impunity against civilians. So more civilians are killed in war today than soldiers. It's a very significant change. More aid workers being killed. So there's that cruelty. But the second thing that we're seeing is there's this terrible phrase, the tribalization of pain. If it's your tribe that's the subject of cruelty, then it's your problem. If it's not your tribe, then it's someone else's problem. As a humanitarian leader, I say, look, we're the human tribe. And that means, and we were founded by Albert Einstein, the International Rescue Committee, as you rightly pointed out. He founded us as a secular agency, interestingly enough, although the primary job was to help victims of the Nazis, Jewish victims of the Nazis in the main, in the 1930s. But he founded us as a secular agency because he believed in universal values. And I think that's what's under threat as well.
What is needed to change this maybe in the short term? Can it be changed in the short term?
Well, I think that in the very short term, we're obviously facing this very striking phenomenon that the number of people in humanitarian need is going up, and aid budgets are going down. We're meeting in the US, but it's not just a US phenomenon. And so I think that the first task really is to make sure that we make the money that we do have go as far as possible. That means focusing on the countries in greatest need, the people in greatest need, the programs that has greatest impact. One of the things I'm most proud of, I mean, we've grown the International Rescue Committee from being a $500 million organization to being a $1.5 billion organization in the last 10 years. We've got smaller this year by about $400 million, so we're dealing with degrowth. Having grown fast, we're now shrinking a bit. But I think that the thing I'm most proud of, one of the things I'm most proud of, is that we're the leaders in impact evaluation. And at a time when aid budgets are going down, it's ironic, we know more about how to make aid go further. And I think we've got a real job to do to achieve that focus on those who are in extreme poverty. We've got to sustain our innovation. I think that's hard to do sometimes when organizations are hunkering down. The danger is that they stop thinking. And we're determined at the IRC to carry on thinking. We see ourselves as the innovation leaders of the humanitarian sector, maybe reflecting back to Einstein. So I think that's really important. But I also think that there's just a fundamental point about, and this is where World Economic Forum, the clue's in your name. If those who reap the rewards of globalization don't bear its burdens, then it's not going to survive. And I think that's an important message. That's why I spoke, that's why I go to Davos and why I participate in World Economic Forum activities. I think it's really important that this ethic of shared responsibility is properly defended.
You talked a little bit about innovation. What are some examples of maybe innovative approaches that you guys have applied recently?
Yeah, well, today we're using AI to diagnose monkeypox in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you can diagnose it in 5 minutes rather than taking 2 weeks. I'm very proud of the work that we've done on acute malnutrition to show how we can have 30% efficiency savings by changing the way in which we diagnose and treat acute malnutrition. I think some of our work on making the humanitarian sector more proactive rather than reactive, using AI to warn farmers about threats to their livelihoods from climate events, we've shown how that allows them to have much greater impact on their lives and livelihoods. I think that's very important. And some of the innovation is not about products, it's about the way we do our business. We work in 4 East African countries where there's a lot of zero-dose kids. In other words, they're not getting vaccinated. And we have a tremendous partnership with the Global Alliance on Vaccines, which has delivered 20 million vaccines to 2 million kids at $2 a shot in areas where they were getting no vaccinations at all because government health systems couldn't reach because of civil conflict. So the way we do our business, I think, is being changed, as well as what the products are that we deliver.
Is there a special role that maybe private sector can be playing that maybe they haven't needed to play in the past, but maybe now it's the moment?
Well, private sector is our risk capital. That's the way I would put it. In some of our most innovative approaches, you don't know if you're going to succeed, and you've actually got to embrace risk and failure. With risks comes the chance of failure, but if you're not failing enough, you're not risking enough. And so our innovation funds pride themselves that they're learning the best of private sector risk appetite. I think that's important. I think that the private capital can be our patient capital as well. Often government funding is short-term. We often say to foundations, look, go multi-year. That's the way to make yourselves distinct, as well as embracing risk. So I think those are important.
Many humanitarian organizations are, trying to create models that are thinking beyond philanthropy. Why is that so important?
Well, I think it's about, by beyond philanthropy, you mean what in this?
Beyond maybe donations alone.
I see, yeah. I mean, we always say share your ideas, share your people, as well as share your funds. And sharing your ideas is what it says. Share your people. We have a fantastic program called Signpost, which is now in 25 instances around the world. It's an information service for displaced people, by displaced people. One obvious issue is cybersecurity. Some of the tech companies have loaned us people to help design so that cybersecurity is there for people. So I think lending your people is important as well. Giving your funds is obviously important, but I think that it's your idea about going beyond philanthropy is to say, make this a relationship, not just a check writing exercise. And what we find with our best private sector partners is that they engage their employees as well, and that motivates them.
Some donor governments have sort of retreated from a variety of organizations, global organizations. Is that, in your mind, is that sort of a weakness in the international system, or do you see it just mostly a failure of political will? Where's the vulnerability?
I did a speech at the University of Notre Dame earlier this month, and I gave a really extraordinary statistic, because you're right, governments are cutting, and nowhere more so than the US, but fully 89% of the US public, yes, 89%, including 84% of Republicans and 94% of Democrats, think that 1% of the federal budget, $1 in 100, should go on overseas aid. 89%. Now, the trouble is, the majority, more than 50%, think that 20% of the federal budget goes on overseas aid. But actually, the vast majority of the American public want the money to be, want 1%, which is the more or less the amount that has been traditionally spent by the US exchequer on overseas aid. And so there's a mismatch there. The Trump administration has made big cuts, but it's been able to do so, I think, because the impression is that there's far more going on overseas aid projects than is actually the case. I don't want to get into the targeting of individual institutions or individual organizations. In the end, it's taxpayers' money. Governments can make their choices. Philanthropic money, philanthropists make their choices. We've had a long-term partnership with governments and with the private sector. We've actually grown. As we've grown as an organization, the share of our income that has been privately raised has gone from about 10-15% to 30%. Obviously, if government cuts continue, that will carry on. Our point is we can have impact and scale. As the example of the $2 a shot vaccinations suggested, I think it's very sad that 300,000 Afghan boys and girls have lost their education because of decisions that were made in government. The US decided it didn't want to spend any more overseas aid money on Afghanistan. In the end, the price is paid by our clients. 2 million clients have lost access to services in the last 9 months.
Why do you think that gap in understanding still exists? That gap between like what actually is given and what people think?
Well, I think that either we've not been spending enough on communications, or half a truth gets all the way around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And I think there's a lot in that, especially today. I think also one's got to understand we're not living through a global financial crisis like 2008, but there is a cost of living crisis for a lot of families in advanced industrialized economies. And that has meant people have tightened their belts and expect governments to tighten their belts as well. It's been too easy to hit overseas aid budgets. That's why our emphasis always at the IRC is being the solutions-oriented NGO, because I think people are still in the market for solutions.
How do you see humanitarian aid maybe changing?
I think it becomes more focused. Hopefully it becomes more focused on the extreme poor. It becomes more focused on programs that are proven and cost-effective. I think it becomes more innovative so that it really is at the cutting edge. It would be a double tragedy if the technological revolution passes by the people in greatest need. I think those are the kind of changes that I advocated in this speech I gave at the University of Notre Dame and what we want to see.
In your mind, given all of this, right, given everything that we've seen on the ground with the humanitarian issues, given what you've sort of reflected on the age of impunity, how would you sort of describe maybe the leadership challenge and how the leadership challenge has changed in the last 5 years?
I think that the leadership challenge is to deal with more disorder. It's a more disordered world. I don't think we're living through de-globalization. I think we're living through a more chaotic form of globalization, a more chaotic age of globalization. And so the biggest challenge is that you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. It feels like there's more disorder. And the disorder can come internally, it can come externally. I think that's the biggest challenge.
And how do we bring order?
I think you bring order through consistency. I think you bring order through alliances. I see alliances as sort of buoys that can help stabilize the ship when the anchor's pulled up. I think one also has to recognize that we have to look for orders, plural, not just order, singular. I think there's going to be multiple, the Columbia University Professor Adam Tooze talks about ordering, not just order. And I think that's a clever point. It's not going to be an age of pure order, but the danger is chaos, and that hurts people. And I think we have to be looking for ordering through consistency, through alliances, through keeping the superordinate goals in mind, because it's easy to be tactical, it's hard to be strategic, and the superordinate goal is what makes you be strategic.
If we are able to put in order or orders, if we're able to have a little bit more consistency, what might be different? What might be different maybe in 2030?
There are some known knowns and then some known unknowns. We know that there is a digital revolution of extraordinary reach and meaning that is transforming lives. We know that the rise of the rest is real. America has sustained its share of global GDP in the last 30 years, but Europe, Canada, Japan have lost share of global GDP. So there's a reordering of economic power around the world that I think is translating into shifts in political power. What we don't know is whether coalitions of the willing will be stronger than those who want to flout the rules. And I think that's really important as we look forward.
And if we don't get this order in place, what will happen?
Well, I think that one of the things that I would say, especially speaking to the World Economic Forum, is that recession in democratic rights, recession in human rights, ends up as recession in property rights. The slide doesn't stop at the private sector. And I think that it's easy for people to scorn public-private partnership. I think it's really important. And it's really important because the rules-based order applies internally and externally. The whole point of the rules-based order that was built after 1945 was to safeguard liberal democratic, that means pluralist democracy, but also safeguards of property rights. The international order was designed to buttress the democratic order at home. And I think that's what's under enormous strain at the moment. And I think that what's at stake, therefore, is the ability of people to make their own choices. Because in the end, the definition of impunity is that someone else makes the choice for you.
To build on that, so many people think about geopolitical conflict, even the climate crisis, even though it's been sort of hitting people more and more at home. Some of these things seem so big, they seem like they don't necessarily touch them at home. What should they be thinking about? Why should they be paying attention?
Well, I think that's a great point. I mean, the late Pope, Francis, talked about the globalization of indifference. Now, I think that's not quite right. I think that it's more to your point. People want to make a big difference, but they don't know if they can. And that's why I think this emphasis on solutions is so important. I think that when governments are in retreat from big global problems, you need NGOs, the private sector, to be the solutions merchants, to be the mobilizers of solutions, because I think people are in the market for solutions. Then the question is, how do you give them agency and a sense of really being able to make a difference? And that's why I think the emphasis on what people do together is so important. Alliances are not just between nations, they're also between people.
Not every leader who's listening to this is dealing directly with some of these issues. They might be dealing indirectly with some of these things. But in general, how can any leader be more accountable, right? Can make sure that they are thinking about the biggest picture possible and the biggest impact possible?
Well, you have to think big and small when you're leading. You have to think big and granular. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. I always think that the best accountability is an accountability that's aligned to your mission. It comes back to the superordinate goal. Too often, accountability is for things that, if not peripheral, they're not actually the real bullseye. And I think the most important thing, we exist as an organization to help people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, recover, and gain control of their futures. That's the outcomes that we try and hold ourselves accountable for. And I can say every single program staff member is working to a program with outcomes. Now, obviously, when you're in the leadership level, you've got to make sure that the proxies that you're using are the right ones and that they're actually on the bullseye of what your mission is. I think that's intelligent accountability is mission aligned.
If there was one question that you would want someone to ask themselves to make sure that they're staying mission aligned, what would that be?
The question I ask myself is, am I listening to a broad enough range of people? I think when I was in politics, I learned this. You need a big tent, but you've got to have the flaps open. And if the flaps aren't open, then you're not going to be hearing a wide enough range of views. I think that's really, the great danger of leadership is you get cut off. We have one rule in my office, whether you're an intern or whatever, which is if you've got a question, ask it. Don't be worried that someone will think you're stupid, because first of all, if you've got that question, probably other people do too. And by asking questions, you can find things that are wrong. No such thing as a bad question, I think.
Keeping the flaps open, listening to as many voices as possible. Was there a moment, maybe in the last 5 years, that was really a turning point for you?
I was in Sudan last month, and we got 400 staff working for us in Sudan. It's the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, as you probably know. There's just been terrible massacres out of El Fasher, the capital of North Darfur. And 400 of our staff, 90% of them are victims of the war themselves. So they've lost their homes, they've lost their jobs. And I spoke to a colleague of mine. She said, well, I lost my home in Khartoum. I was a banker. I lost my job as well. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about that. She said, no, don't be sorry. I'm a humanitarian aid worker now. And so she'd lost her profession, but she found her purpose. And that sticks with me, I think.
How do you make sure that you're keeping exposed to the widest number of influences?
Well, I mean, one can always do better. You never give yourself an A+ for anything. Funnily enough, I'm just talking to my team. We have new country directors. I want to be meeting them. We got the IT department to send a random email every Monday to 10 people in the organization. We were at the time about 16,000 people. To say, tell me what you're doing today. Tell me what I could do to make it better. And things like that, which can seem like a bit of a gimmick, and actually not everyone replies. Some people think it's a fake, it's a fishing expedition. But actually you get interesting stuff coming out from that. A good example of opening the flaps.
What was something that came up from that you wouldn't have known about?
Oh, I think that it was, we've really tried to make our expense module that people were complaining about that wasn't working on our system. They were ideas about how different teams could work together. There was a hunger on the part of staff who were called quote-unquote support staff. They wanted to feel more connected to programs. So some things are obvious, some things that are less obvious that help us get them right.
And what prompted that?
I think it's this thing of, how do you open the flaps? How do you stay fresh? How do you keep in touch with a big organization? I didn't go to business school, but they tell you apparently communicate. The danger is that that's just you talking. You can't be a good leader if you're not a good listener, but you've got to make sure that you're listening to to a wide enough range of people.
Well, what are other ways that you create venues and opportunities for listening?
Well, I think that you can't have a listening session if you've got 1,000 people in the room. So you've got to be willing to curate the right kind of forums, the right kind of avenues. I mean, the good thing about internal messaging is that anyone can message you, and sometimes they do. So I think that you've just got to be proactive about it, and I don't think any leader's ever good enough at it. You've got to keep on it yourself.
How have you changed as a leader? What's something that you do now that maybe you wouldn't have done?
I think the biggest thing, ironically, is that in-person really matters. There's no substitute for it. Now, we're an international humanitarian aid organization as well as a refugee resettlement agency in America. So we could never have everyone, quote unquote, in the office, in the same office. We always needed to work across time zones, across distance, and the fact that the technology is so much better is fantastic. But like you asked me earlier, what was the conversation I remembered? I remember a conversation in person with the banker turned humanitarian aid worker in Sudan. I didn't say, I remember a really good Zoom call. And it's not Zoom's problem. It's that being in person is when you realize that, or when you hear that someone's got a challenge with their kid who's ill, or someone's moving, or someone's got a real trauma that they're trying to overcome, or someone's got a bigger idea that they didn't know how to put it. So I think that it's really, reinforced or enforced that finding time to be in person really matters.
Are there moments at the IRC that you guys really prioritize, hey, these are the things we do in person?
Yeah. But you can't say to every country director we want to all be in the same room. It's hard because you're taking them away from their work. So we find times to do that. You've got to really prepare to make the most of the time that you have together. And I think, we're all trying to feel our way into this new future. When people say, I'm going hybrid, everyone's hybrid these days. The question is, does the online time and the in-person time work to maximum effect? And for creativity, for figuring out risks, in-person can really help.
What do you think leaders will need in the next 5 years to meet the moment?
I think they'll need a bit of luck. There's no question about that. I think I'm big. People say, "Oh, culture eats strategy for lunch." I think strategy frames or creates the context for culture. If your strategy is to hunker down, you need a different culture than if your strategy is to stride forward. And so I'm big on good strategy. I think without that, you're lost. That's your compass.
Strategy that ladders up to your mission.
Yeah. Well, you can't. There's no strategy without. I mean, by definition, the strategy is bankrupt if it's not linked to your mission.
Is there a book you recommend?
I read recently a rather a sobering book, but a clever book by a man called Ivan Krastev called The Light That Failed. And it's about what's happened in Eastern Europe since 1990. And it's quite sobering about how democratic norms take root, how they can be upended, how public-private partnership develops, how it gets rolled back. And the light that failed is the idea that there's a single light. One of his argument is that the idea that there was no alternative to open markets, liberal democratic politics, that was really dangerous, and that created a backlash. It's an interesting book.
And how would it change someone who read it?
I think that they'd never say there is no alternative. There are always alternatives. They may be worse, but that doesn't stop people from plumping for them.
Is there a piece of advice that you've always been grateful for?
I think if you overcalculate, you miscalculate. Someone said that, which I think is a good advice.
How has that helped you?
Well, I think it means that if you feel that something's awry, you're probably right. And if you feel that something's right, it gives you the determination to follow through on it.
And your last question, sir. If you could issue one challenge to CEOs attending Davos in January, what would it be?
The challenge would be, what are you doing to bear the burdens of globalization, not just reap the rewards?
Well, thank you very much, David. I very much appreciate you being here today on this very
course.
blustery fall day here in New York. And thank you so much to all of our listeners and our viewers. For more video podcasts, check out the World Economic Forum's YouTube page. And for more transcripts of Meet the Leader and our other podcast, Radio Davos, go to wef.ch/podcasts.